Okay, I think just about everybody is here. I think let's go ahead and get started before it gets too late, but let me open us in prayer again. Heavenly Father, again, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for the opportunity to be together, and we thank you for the things you have done in the past in our country and in the individuals involved in our past, and we pray that you'll help us to learn from it and help us to begin to see your glory displayed throughout so that we can see what we ought to do and be encouraged in the ways of life ourselves. Thank you again for your great mercies to us through Jesus our Savior. Teach us then, now for Jesus' sake. Amen. Well, this evening I want to follow up a little bit on what we talked about last week, but address some of the issues that have been raised through the growth of critical theory and what has happened in our history. Picking up with Columbus, the 400th anniversary of Columbus' discovery in 1892 was pretty significant. Every nation in Europe and in the West joined in the celebration. It was quite a thing. Some of these tickets and everything show you all the great celebrations. There was a great rejoicing, a time of festivity and praise, and everyone was rejoicing in the way that Columbus had been used. The Roman Catholic Church considered even making Columbus a patron saint during that time. But 100 years later, that I actually, and some of you actually were here when it happened, there was the quincentenary, the 500th anniversary of Columbus' discovery of America, and it was quite different, as you can see. Wanted posters were everywhere. I don't know if you saw them, but on most college campuses you had posters put up, something like what you see there. That's one of the posters that appeared. That's one of the more kind posters there. They charged Columbus with all kinds of crimes. We're told over and over and very loudly that whatever Columbus might have been, he was not a saint. And people demonstrated calling him guilty of genocide and, of course, being a racist and all the other things here. Seldom has a 500th anniversary caused more commotion and more outrage. Alex Ewan, who is editor or was editor of the Journal of Native Nations, said this. He said, Columbus was possessed by an ethic of destruction. We see him sort of like a creature out of science fiction, an alien from another planet, who sort of zipped down and imposed a new way of life against which there had been a guerrilla struggle to this day. Well, the universities of the land had all kinds of demonstrations going on, people wanting, and this still happens every year, where they want to change Columbus Day to Indigenous People Day and not honor Columbus at all. Back in 1992, the University of Illinois changed Columbus Day to a day of mourning, while Arizona State commemorated the day by allowing a Chicano rap group to shout obscenities about European culture, which was, I hope, entertaining for the people there. University of Minnesota enjoyed the entire day of festivities, they said, highlighted by a play about the legacy of Columbus. And of course, it was all bad. It was held in the Heart of the Beast Puppet Theater, which is probably appropriate. Russell Means, who was one of the official spokespersons for the American Indian movement back in the 90s, compared Columbus' atrocities to those of Hitler. He concluded that Columbus makes Hitler look like a juvenile delinquent. Even Fidel Castro, you know how upstanding he is, he proclaimed himself in honor of the quincentenary a Native American, and he let it be known that he had also suffered the memory, just from the memory of Columbus and all the unimaginable ways that Columbus had done all the crimes that Columbus had committed. The National Council of Churches weighed in with an official pronouncement solemnly charging Columbus with crimes of grand theft, racism, initiating the destruction of a culture, rape, torture, maiming of indigenous peoples, invasion, genocide, slavery, and ecocide. The crime of ecocide is the murder of the environment, the murder of nature. Even some reputable scholars chimed in. The year 1992 spawned a whole vast array of books and articles that sought to document Columbus's villainy. Barry Lopez wrote the book The Rediscovery of America. Hans Koenig wrote Columbus and His Enterprise. Ronald Wright talked about the book Stolen Continents, and Kirkpatrick Sale, most prominently perhaps, his book The Conquest of Paradise. All of them sought to substantiate the charge that Columbus was a vast combination of hooligan, hellhound, cutthroat, all the other things that you can imagine, an all-around bad guy. Peter Hume was, in watching all this, said that Columbus scholarship is a fertile ground for that peculiar academic blindness whereby an interesting but indefensible hypothesis is followed to its logically necessary but increasingly lunatic conclusions. And that's exactly what we saw. Now, what are you to make of all of this? And it's you can say, well, that was just a smear campaign. Well, it was, but what was behind it? What's underneath all of this? You could make fun of it, kind of like people canceling Dr. Seuss. Everybody says, "Oh, they're so dumb, that's so stupid." That's a pretty sinister move, and it's all calculated. I mean, they have a reason why they do these things. There's a reason why Columbus is attacked perennially. Every year he's attacked on this. What we saw in 1992 was one of the first public displays of what would come to be called post-colonial theory or post-colonialism, and in an effort, the idea is we have to make an effort to rid the world of the spirit and the structures and the culture that enabled Europeans to dominate the world. It's a decolonization. They say we have to decolonize everything. So decolonization, or post-colonial theory, is built on the idea that there is no objective standard of truth. Knowledge is not founded upon some objective study of reality. Rather, it's based upon the historical experience and perception of various racial and ethnic peoples. There's not a body of knowledge that everybody can agree on, that everybody can look at and go, oh yes, we all agree with that. James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose said this. They said, post-colonial theory holds that objective knowledge, that which is true for everyone regardless of their identity, is unobtainable because knowledge is always bound up with cultural values. So the idea that there is no objective, knowable truth is what underlies all of this. Truth that can and should be embraced by all human beings. They say that is purely a Western, and when they say Western, they're saying most Christian. It's a Western Christian construct. In other words, it's erected to preserve white supremacy, racism, and racial oppression. And so the idea of objective truth is merely an invention of Western Christian man for the purpose of maintaining his power, his dominance over the rest of the world. Lindsay and Pluckrose describe it this way. They say, the West has constructed the idea that rationality and science, that is the methods by which we learn about reality, are good in order to perpetuate its own power and marginalize non-rational, non-scientific forms of knowledge production from elsewhere. Therefore, We must now devalue white Western ways of knowing for belonging to white Westerners and promote Eastern ones in order to equalize the power imbalance. So in other words, the West, Europeans have dominated everything. They've oppressed everyone. And they use this idea of objective knowledge, the ability to look objectively at reality and try to learn from reason and science and all the rest what reality is like. That has to be now devalued. That is, it has to be rejected. That way of knowing is not legitimate, they're saying. You have to have other ways. You have to give equal legitimacy, and of course they give supremacy to other non-rational, non-scientific forms of knowledge. Lindsay and Pluckrose go on. He says, for theory, that is for this critical theory, the knowledge that is currently most valued is intrinsically white and Western, and it interprets this as an injustice, no matter how reliably that knowledge was produced. The knowledge may be clearly verifiable. In other words, there's evidence for it, there's really no debate about it, but it still has to be rejected because it supports the whole system of white supremacy, of European oppression, Western Christian oppression. Now, when you think about all this, there are some things that we have to acknowledge and grant. This view, like so many other heretical and revolutionary ideas, is in reaction to what was a very real evil. Non-Christian colonialism grew out of the perversion of the Great Commission. As Christians, remember, we're called to disciple the nations. We're to go and we really see men and cultures transformed. Not transformed by imposing our opinions upon them or just our ways of living upon them, but preaching the gospel to them so that God, by His grace, changes men and conforms them to His word. But we are in the business of wanting to see cultures changed. We want culture to conform to the culture of God. That's what discipling the nations mean. The idea then of Christians going from their homes and seeking to evangelize the nations does in fact, of course, presuppose an objective, infallible standard of justice and peace and righteousness. We must have the Bible or we can't do this job. But if you reject the just and righteous standard, then all that is left, if you intend to transform the world, is the imposition of man-made standards, and you have to impose them by force, which is what secular colonialism sought to do. And this actually did happen. You can do a little reading on some of the things that are said by some British proponents of colonialism and of course some Americans, and it's the kind of thing that you hear. They view that certain particular peoples are created for a certain thing. Chinese are good workers, they say. Africans are great servants. They can do a lot of hard work. And they view various races that way. So that you have to impose upon them your standards, your way of thinking and your culture, your way of living, so that they can be like you, and that is, be equal to the superior. You are the superior. It's a great evil, really, when it gets down to it, and it really is legitimately to be opposed, but it must be opposed in the right way. Post-colonialism is the reaction to this perverted view of transforming the world. And thus, post-colonialism is just as evil as the evil it's seeking to correct. Since there's no infallible standard of truth that they acknowledge, no infallible standard of ethics or morals, what we appeal to as true and moral and righteous are purely efforts to protect the particular ideals and truth and standards that we happen to embrace. They're merely structures to preserve our dominance and power over others. That's the view. That's the view that's the way they look at us. And so that includes, if you're a Christian, then you're just taking Christian arbitrary standards. And therefore, it just supports the Western white dominance, white supremacy. So it is racist, and it must be taken down in order to respect various other truth claims of the non-white races and cultures. Well, this means that everything that is judged Western and Christian must be destroyed in order to balance the power disparities that Western Christian culture has produced. Now, I'm speaking from their perspective, you see. So that history has to be rewritten in order to correct the distortions of Western Christian bias. And this requires that all the symbols that support that particular false view of history that is imposed upon us by Christians and the whites, that false biased history must be taken down, and all the symbols that support that biased history must be taken down. So the statues have to be pulled down. And it really doesn't matter. The details about the individual are not that important. If he would stand for Western Christian ideas, he's a racist. He has to go down. The names of buildings have to be changed. Memorials, which honor our racist past, have to be removed because they promote and defend the violence and injustice of our colonial past. This is what we see going on all around us. It has a rationale, even though when you watch it, sometimes you go, this is just insanity. Well, of course it is, but there's a rationale behind it that you need to kind of see what they're doing and how they're thinking. Well, this new history that they want to impose now in the place of the history we've had is not obliged to prove its claims according to standards of normal historical research, because those standards, they would say, are biased, they're racist, and therefore discriminatory. They have to be, they're only there because they protect white supremacy. So what you're doing now is doing a different kind of research. It's called research justice. And the normal expectations of scholarly research do not apply when you're pursuing research justice. So you can make all kinds of claims, distort the evidence without any, and not have any confirmatory evidence of your position at all. You can just do it, and still you can be taken seriously. That's what's happening, for example, with the 1619 Project. This has been exposed by historians who look at it and they say, this is all wrong. This has no historical evidence to support it. It's historically inaccurate. The author of it is not a historian, Nicole Hannah-Jones. She's a journalist, and she actually admitted that it isn't a history, she said. It's a reflection upon the black experience and has its ultimate goal not really teaching history, but to promote reparations. She said, if you read the whole project, I don't think you can come away from it without understanding the project is an argument for reparations. So it's a distortion of history politicized for the purpose of power. The very sin that the critical race theory proponents accuse Western Christians of doing. They are doing the same thing. So, to return, why then are the European discoverers denounced and demonized? Well, they are representatives of Christendom. They are representatives in the minds of critical theory proponents of racism, white supremacy, and colonial oppression. And therefore, they have to be delegitimized. They have to be attacked. They were the products of the Christian culture, and because of that, they have been oppressors. They have been the ones who have caused the problems in the world. In spite of the obvious prejudice, there are legitimate questions that we need to try to answer. I'm not sure it makes a great deal of difference to those people, but to some Christians who have genuine questions, it's important that we try to say, wait a minute. Of course, there are issues with all of these men, every one of them. There's not a man who ever was involved in any kind of history, or who ever lived, of course, who never sinned, who did everything absolutely perfectly, except for Jesus. And so was Columbus a sinful man? Yes, he was. And he actually confessed that. How was he obsessed with gold? Sometimes he was. He fell into being obsessed with obtaining gold. Did he mistreat the natives? Well, maybe not personally, but he allowed it sometimes. So yes, he was guilty of that as well. What about, was he immoral? Well, it's not clear specifically of what people charge him, but I'm sure that there was an issue somewhere along the way, like it is for so many, many people. But you see, if that's true, they want to come back. What's interesting is how these people are so puritanical and pharisaical when it comes to other people's morality. They don't mind themselves engaging in all kinds of immorality and ungodliness, but if they can catch him stealing something or having a mistress or doing that, well, then that's just horrifying. That disqualifies him from any kind of honor. And that's what this is all about. So as a Christian, you don't want to excuse sin no matter where it is. We need to condemn it. Wherever it's obvious, whenever it's proven to be true, we will stand against it, no matter who it is. But we also need to be those who judge charitably and righteously, give righteous judgments. And so that's what I want to do, is to address some of these accusations that are directed at Columbus, but they could be directed at others as well. So, was Columbus a prideful, greedy, covetous man? Well, as I said, he was a man, therefore he was a sinner. And as a sinner, he is subject to pride and covetousness as much as any other sinner. And he never denied that, by the way. We can't ignore or justify his sins, but normally you try to understand and view others, of our brothers and sisters, with sympathy. Even though you can't excuse their sins, you can try to sympathize with them as you call them to repentance and encourage them in new obedience. So what do we say about Columbus in this regard? Well, first, remember that he was concerned to provide for his family. He had a family. He was not a pure adventurer, one who could follow his dreams without any concern about people around him. Nobody's really like that, but Columbus wasn't that way. He was a man who felt responsibility to care for his family. He had a son by his first wife, and his first wife gave him the son Diego, and his second wife, Beatriz Enriquez, gave him his second son, Ferdinand. So he had children, and he had a wife to care for all the time. And the reality of his obligations to his family made the business aspects of his voyage important to him, as it would for us as well. What about, secondly, remember that Columbus was taking a great risk in taking on this voyage, and he expected to be rewarded for it. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. For modern people, risk-taking has become a foreign experience to the vast majority. In fact, risk-taking is viewed as a threat to our well-being. If somebody starts taking a risk, everybody else gets nervous. Anyone who refuses to take all necessary prudent precautions is viewed as a thoughtless, reckless danger to everyone around him. Risk has become a four-letter word to the people of our day. And for this reason, the idea of being rewarded for taking risk is alien and somehow suspicious and even offensive to people. It sounds undemocratic. In spite of this modern spirit, though, we have to acknowledge that taking on a venture for profit and the idea of a laborer being worthy of his hire is perfectly legitimate. We need to recognize, too, the hypocrisy of those who criticize Columbus for doing this. I have never met a historian or a college professor or a writer who objected to being paid for his work. They don't turn down money. And in fact, they get offended if you don't pay them. Even professional protesters of our day don't refuse the pay that they're promised for protesting. They accept it, and they get on the bus and go to the next spot. Nobody refuses to be paid for his labor. Only the most indoctrinated socialist could fault Columbus for this, so that really doesn't stand. But thirdly, what Columbus felt the pressure to succeed, not only to meet his own needs, but also to profit the sovereigns of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, who had stood behind him at great risk for themselves. They had taken on a lot of expense to fund his voyage, and he desperately wanted to be sure they didn't lose any money for that. And so there was a lot of pressure on him, and that undoubtedly played a role in his obsession, sometime obsession to find gold in every harbor, because he wanted to be able to pay back Ferdinand and Isabella for their support. But there's one last thing that most people have never heard about, and it was a dominant motive for Columbus. He had a desire to finance a crusade to free the Holy Land from Muslim rule. It's difficult for us. I mean, if you're a modern, many people when they hear that, they go, oh, well, there you go. That proves he's a scoundrel. He's going to finance a crusade. But really, there was a very sincere motive. It's difficult for us in the 20th century to realize how much the desire for God's glory and honor and the salvation of the world pervaded the people of the Middle Ages. We simply cannot identify with it. But it's true. The Crusades were the natural outgrowth of this fervent passion to have Christ acknowledged and worshiped in all the earth. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean the Crusades were pure and spotless, that they were holy in every aspect. They were the outgrowth of this fervent passion, but the motives of the people who involved in it involved thousands of people. Well, of course, there were people there who had bad motives. They were not well-intentioned. There was hypocrisy among the Crusaders. There was greed. There was pride. There was cruelty manifested and present in many of the participants. But none of that negates the holy desire that formed the backdrop of the Crusades. The zeal with which men risked their lives for God's glory is amazing, and it is incomprehensible to men who love nobody but themselves. Columbus drank deeply of this well, and he wanted with all his heart to be one who could help finance another crusade to free the Holy Sepulchre, he said, of course, the grave of Christ, from the hands of the Muslims. And so, to understand this, we need to think about what was really going on in the late 14th century. Islam had long been recognized as the mortal enemy of Christianity. From the Battle of Tours in the 8th century with Charles the Hammer and the Franks turning back the Muslim armies and preserving Europe, through the 6 crusades that occurred in the 11th through the 13th centuries, Christendom had realized that Islam was devoted not to peaceful coexistence, but to total extermination of Christianity from the earth. And they were not satisfied, the Muslims were not satisfied with philosophical or theological persuasion. To the Muslims, this was a war that had to be won by force. It was a holy war. It was a jihad. And the enemies, as Muhammad said, were the Jews and Christians. Fight against such, he said. Fight against such of those to whom the scriptures were given as believe not in Allah. They must be utterly subdued, for they worship their rabbis and their monks as gods. All non-Muslims are anathema. He goes on, O true believers, take not the Jews and Christians for your friends. They cannot be trusted. They are defiled filth. Allah's messenger has commanded, fight against unbelievers and kill them. Pursue them until even a stone would say, come here, Muslim. There is an infidel hiding himself behind me. Kill him quickly. Those are the words of the Quran. And Christians begin to realize there is no coexistence, no peaceful coexistence with these people. It's easy for citizens in our day, in our country, to hold the idea that all religions are peaceful and loving. Islam, however, has presented itself quite differently historically, though it presents itself as a very tolerant faith today, who merely seeks to worship Allah in peace. And the present day presentation is, well, of course, we have fanatics, like Christians have fanatics, Muslims have fanatics, but Islam is the religion of peace, and that's the face that they want to put on it. But the fact is that Louis Farrakhan's views are not extreme. They are mainstream Muslim positions. Jihad is and always has been central to Islam. And jihad not only intensified in the 15th century, the rise of the more militant Ottoman Turks raised the ante considerably, so that in 1402 the Turkish Sultan Bajazet vowed that he would sit on the throne of Constantinople, he would feed his horses on the altar of St. Peter's, and abolish the worship of Christ throughout the world. By 1453, the Ottoman Turks, under the leadership of Mehmed II, Sultan Mehmed II, had conquered all the Byzantine Empire except for the city of Constantinople. And at dawn on May 29, 1453, the Turks began their final assault on Constantinople, and they conquered the city. They were victorious, and the final blow was given by Muhammad's Janissaries. That was the army of children that they had kidnapped from Christians, and the Turks trained them up to be Muslim warriors. And the Janissaries were frightful warriors. At Muhammad's command, an imam climbed into the pulpit of the famous church at Sancta Sophia and sounded the cry of Islam. From the pulpit of that church, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That sent shockwaves across Europe. The Byzantine Empire, which had been a barrier against Islam for over 8 centuries, had now fallen. The great threat grew greater as the Turks attacked Naples in 1480, coming within 100 miles of Rome, and murdered the archbishop and many Christian priests. And Europe fell into a panic. Doomsayers had a heyday. The last days that Jesus had predicted had finally arrived, they said. These were surely the end times, they said. Other voices began calling for a renewal of the Crusades. Each of the popes during the last half of the 15th century made crusading a central tenet of their policies, so that by 1491, most of the people in Europe had little hope for the future. They felt that the future was over for them. Islam was going to conquer. Christian civilization was not only shrinking geographically, but it was becoming hopelessly divided theologically, because, of course, here the Reformation is coming on strong as well. So the Muslim tide seemed insurmountable and unstoppable. Islam held the Holy Land in an iron grip. 300 years of crusades had not regained the Holy Sepulchre, and each of them had failed. The Ottomans had conquered the ancient Byzantine Empire. They had overrun most of Greece and Albania and Serbia, and would soon be threatening Vienna. It was a time of despair. Now, in light of that, it's striking that Columbus is the one who comes along as very optimistic. He stands alone against this dark background and shines brightly. He was convinced that God would use him to turn the tide and bring about new advances for the gospel by taking the gospel to the Isles of the East. That would be one thing. He will do that. And by means of doing that, he would get the gold and the riches to finance a crusade to go then to take back the Holy Land. He believed that God would provide fresh finances for a new crusade, new renewed efforts to gain back the Holy Sepulchre. Muslims threatened to persecute Christians in the Middle East as well as to destroy Israel. They tore down so many things. If you go there today, you will see so many things were destroyed that used to be there that Christians used to go to see, have been destroyed by the Muslims, and it happened during this period. So gold to finance that crusade was uppermost in his mind. It's one of those things that he never got away from. In fact, Bartolomé Las Casas says this, and he records this. That's Columbus, he says that he trusts in God and that on his return, which he intended to make from Castile, he would find a barrel of gold which those whom he had left there should have obtained by barter, and they would have found the gold mine and the spices, and in such quantity that the sovereigns within 3 years would undertake and prepare to go on the conquest of the holy places. For so, he says, I protested to your highnesses that all the gain of this my enterprise should be expended on the conquest of Jerusalem. And your highnesses smiled and said that it pleased them, and that even without this they had just that inclination. So Columbus wants that. That's the thing that's driving him most of all. He wrote to Pope Alexander VI to reiterate this concern. He said the enterprise must be undertaken in order to spend any profits therein for the redemption of the sepulchre and the Temple Mount and the Holy Church. So his hopes for such a venture never waned. At the end of his life, he continued to dream about the fact that there would be one more crusade to free the Holy Land, with the expectation of future revenues to come, which he trusted would one day result from his discoveries. He made provision in his will for a number of things, for 3 things in particular. He wanted legacies to pay the ancient debts of his father, so he wanted to pay off the debts of his father. He wanted a portion to go to build a chapel in Hispaniola. And the 3rd thing he specifies in his will, that there be a fund used for the recovery of the Holy Sepulchre. He made a point of mentioning it in his will and exhorting his descendants to do everything in their power to bring that about. So, as George Grant has said, Columbus sailed not to discover a new world, but to find a way to recover the old one. And that's really true. And these reasons all together did conspire to keep gold in the forefront of his mind and heart. Did he fall into covetousness? Well, probably. I mean, we don't know his heart, but was he a blind idolater or worshiper of filthy lucre? Well, hardly. He was a sinner who confessed his sins, and he trusted that he was forgiven by the blood of Jesus. But to modern worshipers of money, that fact alone is sufficient to convict him of high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, the second charge is that he was immoral. He took a mistress. Didn't he live in an adulterous relationship with a woman he never married? Well, quickly, let's look at that. Columbus married in 1479 Philippa Moniz Perestrello, and he and Philippa had one son, Diego, before she died of consumption in 1484. It's commonly claimed that he then took a mistress 3 years later, Beatriz Enriquez de Arana. She's from the family of Arana in 1487. Beatriz is the mother of Columbus' second son, Ferdinand, and the claim is that Columbus never married. Ferdinand is an illegitimate son. There's no marriage record, they say, and that indicates that she was simply a mistress. Well, there was an article that was written in Verbum, which was a newsletter from St. Thomas Aquinas Seminary, that addressed these charges, and there were 4 points that they made primarily. They said, first, the lack of a marriage record proves nothing, since prior to the Council of Trent, marriage records were not strictly required, and that is true. Even in our country, marriage records were not always supplied. People had a public proclamation of their marriage, but they didn't always file forms and write it all out, and that was certainly true in Europe in the Middle Ages. But secondly, an illicit affair, they said, would not have been tolerated by Beatrice's family. They were very proud family, and Columbus remained on the best of terms with her family throughout his life. One of the family members, in fact, Columbus appointed to be governor of Haiti. So there was no friction between Beatrice's family and Columbus. They loved and respected him, and he them. Thirdly, they say, Queen Isabella kept strict surveillance over the morals of the citizens of Cordoba, where Columbus and Beatrice lived. It is inconceivable. Isabella was quite a lady. It's inconceivable that she would have named Columbus's son Ferdinand as a page for her son, which she did, if she had thought there was the slightest possibility that he was somehow illegitimate. So that seems to mitigate against it. And then fourth, the charge that Beatrice was merely a mistress didn't rise until 72 years after Columbus's death. He had specified that no illegitimate descendant should receive any part of the inheritance, and so this was challenged by a man named Cristobal, who actually turned out to be the illegitimate son of Louis Columbus, but he sought to try to prove that Ferdinand was an illegitimate son. He lost his case because he wasn't able to provide one document or one reliable witness to prove his case. And then fifthly, the court historian of Ferdinand and Isabella describes Columbus as having two marriages. He married Felipa Muñez de Pestrello, and by her had Diego Colon, and after the death of his first wife, he married a second called Beatriz Enriquez in the city of Cordoba, by whom he had Fernando, a virtuous gentleman and highly lettered. To this day, there is no firm evidence that from any of Columbus's contemporaries, even his most hostile enemies, ever raise a question about the propriety of his relationship with Beatrice. So that really is not something that we need to pay any attention to. But thirdly, didn't Columbus commit terrible atrocities against the natives? Many scholars have said that there were such atrocities committed, and they always portray the natives of the West Indies as a very peaceful, trusting, noble individuals. And therefore they view the Europeans coming in as being very cruel, having this racist superiority about them, and Columbus was one of those who had that attitude. The common line runs then that the natives lived in peaceful harmony with the environment and with one another. They had a primeval paradise until Columbus and the Europeans came and spoiled it all. So, for example, Gary Nash, a historian, charges that Columbus embodied a peculiar European quality of arrogance, an arrogance rooted in irrational hostility to the Indians. Kirkpatrick Sale, again, historian, says that Columbus presumed the inferiority of the natives, and he embodied the basic ingredients of the Western racist imagination that was bred to fear what it did not comprehend and to hate what it knew as fearful. Supposedly, the Western people, you and I, we hate everything different from us. Anybody that's different from us, we immediately suspect of great crimes and misdemeanors. So that's the charge. The truth was actually quite the opposite. Columbus was prejudiced toward the Taínos, the first tribe he met, but he was prejudiced in their favor. He didn't think that they were inhuman or lower in their worth, but he thought they were superior. He described them in glowing terms. Dinesh D'Souza makes this point. He says, Columbus described the Taínos as the handsomest men and the most beautiful women he had ever encountered. He praised their generosity and lack of guile, contrasting their virtues with Spanish vices. He insisted that although they were without religion, they were not idolaters. He was confident that their conversion would come through gentle persuasion and not through force. The reason, he noted, is that Indians possess a high natural intelligence. There's no evidence that Columbus thought that Indians were congenitally or racially inferior to Europeans. In fact, it's quite the opposite, and that's true. That's just one of the places where Columbus talks about the Indians, and it's clear that he's got this rosy view of them, and he clearly does not know them at all. later on he would realize how wrong he was about his initial judgment. But you need to see his initial judgment was, oh, they're not Christians, but they're not idolaters. They're not like pagans. They're not real pagans. They're kind of people waiting for the truth. And it's funny how to see how he was giving them such a benefit of the doubt at every point. And he was not the only one who did that. Most of the early explorers were influenced by the myth of the noble savage. I want to address that later on. But they consequently, when they met the natives, at least at first, and when they saw, like Columbus saw the Taínos welcoming and peaceful behavior, he interpreted that as signs that they were superior human beings. They're not like the Spanish who are so suspicious and have all these vices. These people are so innocent and pure, and they naturally welcome strangers and all of that. Well, that's the way he interpreted it. Now, of course, the reality was they were terrified of Columbus and his men. They'd never seen anybody like this. These men come from the sea, and they come in these boats, and they come off, and they're wearing armor, and they look like gods to the Taínos. The Taínos was hoping, well, look, if we befriend these guys, they'll help us kill the Caribs, the other tribe that was terrorizing them all the time. And so they were trying to win the favor of Columbus so that he and his men would fight for them and defend them against their enemies. It was much like what happens, as we shall see, what happened with Cortez when his men at first entered into Mexico and seeing the tribes of Montezuma. Well, the myth of the noble savage is preserved throughout and even to this day, and the idea that the Native Americans that were here when Columbus arrived were the highest examples of the noble savage that the world has ever seen. And yet, in spite of that, the racist Europeans attacked them and exploited them and destroyed their culture and stole their land. The unspoken implication is that's the way Christians treat people who disagree with them, who are strangers to them. They've always treated people like that. They consider the rest of the world inferior. Well, the question then you would have to ask is, what's the proof of that? Is there proof of that? And again, without question, there were some injustices and things that we should not excuse. There were crimes committed against some of the Indians by some of the men. Does that prove that Columbus' Christianity or his sincerity is really a fraud? Does it demonstrate that he was some elaborate hypocrite? And again, charity demands that we seek to see these things in light of the whole truth. The context is important. So let's look at them real quickly. Slavery. Man-stealing is a crime, of course. Whenever it's carried out, it's indefensible. But Columbus, actually the people that actually were enslaved were willing slaves. The Taínos wanted to be protected by Columbus. So we have to realize that. We also need to realize that slavery was a common and accepted part of life in the 15th and 16th centuries, and it remained that way throughout the world until the latter part of the 19th century, and it still is a common part of life in many parts of the world. That's the thing we don't often remember. Every culture, every people, every race has been enslaved at one time or another. Every one of us, in that sense, are the descendants of slaves. So the same was true, of course, in the Indies. Slavery was commonplace among the Indians of the Caribbean, as it was among all of the tribes of North America, the so-called Native Americans, as it has been throughout all peoples, throughout all of history. Everybody has enslaved people and been enslaved by people. It's often forgotten that the people we call Native Americans are actually of Mongolian descent, and they migrated to this continent sometime in the far distant past from northern Asia. Prior to this migration, this continent was inhabited by people that were truly very primitive tribes of Native Americans who had actually killed, enslaved, and exiled people that they found when they got to this continent. Who were truly, I guess, the Native Americans to this land. And this explains why so many of the Indians were baffled when white people, Europeans, tried to bargain for land. We'd try to pay for it. As Christians, you wanted to do something. You didn't want to just steal things. But if that was their land, then you wanted to buy it. So they made offers to buy it. And the Indians were kind of baffled by that. And they were baffled because they had just simply killed the people and took the land. It didn't bother them a bit to do that. John Greenway actually talks about how a European was speaking with a Polynesian chief, an English officer, and the Polynesian chief said this: "I don't understand you English. You come here and take our land, and then you spend the rest of your lives trying to make up for it. When my people came to these islands, we just killed the inhabitants, and that was the end of it. We didn't have any problems. Why do you make this so difficult?" Columbus soon realized that slavery was not something confined to Europe or Africa. The mild-mannered Tainos were regularly enslaved by the bands of Caribs, and many of those, as I mentioned, that Columbus is accused of enslaving were willing slaves because they wanted protection from the Caribs. And the reason they wanted protection from the Caribs was because that being a slave of the Caribs was usually very unpleasant, but it usually was very short because the Caribs were cannibals. In fact, the word cannibal comes from the name of this tribe. They called them originally Caribals, and they had their own favorite gourmet food that they loved. More than one search party found evidence of their preferences. Samuel Morrison says this: "In the huts deserted by the warriors who ungallantly fled, that is when the Spanish came, they found large cuts and joints of human flesh, shin bones set aside to make arrows of, Caponized Arawak boy captives who were being fattened for the griddle, and girl captives who were mainly used to produce babies, which the Caribs regarded as a particularly toothsome morsel." It's clear that Columbus, like most of his contemporaries, saw nothing inherently wrong with or inherently evil with slavery. He wasn't, however, a wild-eyed slave merchant. His motives for taking some of the Indians back to Spain was to teach them the language, teach them Spanish so that they could be taught and be used as translators for missionaries who would be sent to the natives. And so you would have these, the Tainos or the Caribs or whoever else would be translators for the missionaries, and the gospel would be spread through them. And you have a section of the journal, I'm not going to try to read that, from November 12, 1492. Columbus apparently was seeking to follow biblical strictures that would later justify slavery only in the event that the victims were genuine prisoners of war, or you were defending, or they were attacking innocent people. The so-called slave trade that Columbus engaged in consisted of captives from among the Caribs and those of the island of Hispaniola who had attacked his men. And instead of killing them, he just took them and enslaved them. Now, was this slavery biblically justified? Well, I don't know that we have enough information to say it was. It probably wasn't in every case. But was Columbus a big slave trader? No, not any more than anyone else in the 15th century, and considerably less than many others that we could name in that century, or our own for that matter. So what about the second thing, the oppression and mistreatment? Well, there are a number of things that, again, that did occur, but in spite of that reality, we can say it would have been much worse apart from the restraining influence of Columbus. He actually, many of the things that happened were contrary to his own orders that he had insisted upon. The journals are replete with notations from Columbus that tell about how the natives ought to be treated fairly, justly, kindly, and generously. There should be no stealing from them. If you're going to get anything, you need to barter or buy it. So that over and over again, he commands them, that his men, not to mistreat them. They didn't always follow his orders, as you can imagine, and so sometimes things were done contrary to what he wanted. He was not always so just and compassionate. He can be rightly blamed for an incident where he defended the Spaniards over against the Indians when his men provoked an attack by what they had been doing to the Indians. And so there are things that Columbus did that were wrong there. It was a very difficult situation to try to contain and control. The other provocation, of course, in regard to what happened, what would be considered wrong overreactions or mistreatment, were provoked by the increasing awareness of the truth about the natives' true nature. The longer they were with the natives, they began to understand that what they thought was just inherent goodness was not correct. Columbus was horrified when he returned on his second voyage to discover a number of sailors that he had left behind had been killed and eaten by the Arawaks. And so Columbus and his men began to realize that the pagans were not nice people inherently. They were brutal and cruel, just like Europeans, just like the barbarians of Europe. They were children of Satan who came to kill, steal, and destroy. And further, Columbus' panic over the lack of gold forced these things as well, forced issues for him. He wanted to have he wanted to gain as much gold as possible. He forced the natives of Hispaniola to provide a hawk's bell full of gold dust every 3 months, and that was impossible. They didn't have that much gold. And so it became overbearing and a difficult thing. One of the things that Columbus later on confessed that he had sinned before God. But even at its worst, when you look at all the things that happened and all the things that Columbus himself confessed and other things, it's far from anything close to genocide. By far the majority of the Indians died not because of mistreatment or because of unprovoked attack, but because of contagious diseases that they had never encountered before from Europeans. Europeans brought them over on the boats, and the natives contracted them, and many of them died. Now, this, of course, was a two-way street because the Europeans also caught diseases from the Indians that they had never encountered before, and many of them died as well. But that's the cause for most of the deaths that actually occurred among the natives, hardly a genocide. In fact, one of the things that comes to the fore over and over again is how restrained the Europeans, for the most part, were when they faced the cruelty and the barbarism of the pagan tribes. This credit has to go to Christianity. There was a great deal of scholarship ongoing that later on was published from the church on how to view and treat these native peoples. Pope Paul III issued a bull, Sublimis Deus, in 1537, and these directives were given. Indians, he said, and all other people who may later be discovered by the Christians are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or the possession of their property, even though they be outside the faith of Jesus Christ, nor should they be in any way enslaved. Should the contrary happen, it shall be null and of no effect. Indians and other peoples should be converted to the faith of Jesus Christ by preaching the word of God and by the example of good and holy living. And then later on, the scholar, at the same time, there was this Jesuit scholar, theologian, Francisco de Vitoria, and Francisco Suarez, and there were others as well, who began the work of drawing up principles from the Bible that would guide Europeans in their interactions with the natives. How do Christians interact with these peoples who are not Christian and are primitive? How should you treat them? Well, protecting them and not violating their human rights in the way we would talk about it today was what they worked on. So they have rights as being creatures of God. They're to be respected. And so Vittoria and others said that the natural rights of the Indians should be respected, that their conversion should be obtained through persuasion and not by force, and that their land and property should be secure from arbitrary confiscation, and that their right to resist Spanish incursions according to just war theory be upheld. In other words, they have the right to defend themselves. You can't go in there expecting that you can just run roughshod over them. If you attack them, they have the right to defend themselves, and you can't complain about it. So realize what we're talking about here. More than a century before John Locke and 2 centuries before the American War for Independence, theologians at the University of Salamanca developed the first outlines of what we would call the modern doctrine of human rights, biblical rights, the rights of men. These things are the direct result of the influence of the Bible and the effort to apply God's law to this new situation that the Europeans were encountering, and to apply it in a way that would honor Jesus and serve as a restraint against mistreatment and injustice. That is practically, that would never have happened from any other culture except the distinctively Christian culture that prevailed in the Middle Ages. Well, Columbus ended his days in bitter disappointment. He never found a way to Japan and China that he was thinking he would find. He never received the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. He was painfully aware of his failures morally. His last words were, "Into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit." And he died one of the most important and controversial men in history. Was he a perfect man? No. Was he orthodox in every view? No. Did he do things that Christians ought not to do? Yep. But so do you, and so do I, and so does every Christian. Judged fairly in light of the realities of pre-Reformation Europe, Columbus reflects many of the best qualities of the men of his day. And surely in the midst of all his flaws, we're able to see a greatness born of God's grace. But you see, to our modern self-righteous guardians of purity, that was really his greatest crime. Columbus is vilified not because he was particularly evil. There have been people before and since who have been far greater, far more wicked and brutal than he was. But he's assaulted simply because he had the temerity to believe that certain things were right and good and true, and their opposites were wrong and evil and false. He believed the Bible to be inherently a better rule of life for men than paganism and paganism's cruel rituals. In the final analysis, that is Columbus's greatest crime in the eyes of modern critics, and there is no forgiveness for sin in their eyes. This is all, you see, rooted in the Revolutionary War against Christendom. This goes beyond multiculturalism. Back in the 80s and 90s, we were talking about multiculturalism, the effort to put all cultures on the same level and say no one was inherently better than another. Biblically, that's false, of course. Clearly, there is evil in the world, and cultures need to be judged by the standard of evil, not like our president judged the way China treats the Uyghurs. He said that's just a different norm. They have different norms over there, and they're expected to do different ways of thinking. You don't commit genocide and say that's okay because you've got a different cultural norm. That's not equal to what the Bible teaches we are to be. Multiculturalism was one thing. This is something different. This is an effort to make unbelieving culture superior to Christian culture. What is being promoted today is the inferiority of Christian culture. They are actually saying that this is worse. The accusations against the explorers and the founding fathers and other famous men in history and now Bible-believing Christians in our day is an effort to show that the position we hold is not a valid option for men. In fact, they're going to maintain that our views are dangerous threats to liberty and equality and justice and peace. Now think about this. These same people who excoriate Columbus are strangely short of righteous indignation when it comes to Pol Pot or Mao Zedong or Ho Chi Minh or Castro or Lenin or Stalin or any number of truly evil men who have lived in modern times. When was the last time you heard any of these people denounce Lenin for genocide or Stalin? They actually did it. When was the last time that the National Council of Churches condemned Martin Luther King or Bill Clinton or Joe Biden or any other progressive left for immorality? Don't hold your breath. That's not going to happen. Why are the Carib Indians forgiven for the sins of sodomy, cannibalism, rape, murder, savage slavery, and racism, while Columbus is ridiculed and anathematized for expressing a desire to have them become Christians? You have to ask those kinds of questions. But truth is not really the goal of our modern crusaders. The blatant double standard is used to judge men and movements in history. That standard reveals the true agenda. The true agenda is really to express deep hatred for Jesus and his kingdom. And that's why we have to know these things and have them have some grounding in the truth so that we can stand against this onslaught of evil. Okay, let me stop there quickly. Are there any questions or observations or comments that you'd like to make? Oh, yeah. How many tribes did they fight? Oh, I don't know. These were the Indians in the island, so there were only 4 or 5 tribes. I don't really know how many, but so they encountered those. They didn't fight them all, but they did have to defend themselves sometimes. Yeah. Admiral of the Ocean Sea. That's Samuel Morrison's biography of Columbus. That's probably the leading biography of Columbus from the world would say, yeah, that guy's the best. He was not. Samuel Morrison, as far as I know, was not an overt Christian. He may have been, but I'm not sure about that. John Eidsmoe has written a book on Columbus and Cortez, Conquerors for Christ, which is very good. George Grant's book, The Last Crusader, is about Columbus, and that's pretty good too. So there are a number of good books from Christians that point out a lot of things that some of the Morrison points out a good number of things, but he doesn't go into investigate the Christianity of Columbus heavily. He just says, "Oh yeah, the guy was a great Christian." Any other things? Okay, I want to move to Cortez next week and the encounter with the Aztecs in Mexico. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for your blessings to us again. Thank you for how you help us to understand things, and we ask that you will help us to see more clearly what you've done in the past so that we can understand our place and what has happened to bring us to this place and be able to think through and have wisdom to know what to do from here on. Teach us your word so that we can think faithfully and grow in wisdom and in discernment and be able to see what course to take and what's the best way forward. Thank you again for this time together. Bless us as we go to our homes. For Jesus' sake, amen.